This is the Cardiff Business School podcast, where we explore the power of public value in everything that we do. My name is Peter Wells. I'm the Pro Dean of Public Value and the host of this podcast series. And my guest today is Dr. Genevieve Shanahan. Genevieve, welcome.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. And I've asked you here today, well, for lots of reasons, really. I love your energy. I love your enthusiasm for your topic and so on. But particularly, I'm interested in your interest in alternative organizations. And I'd like to start with a sense of why. Why are you interested in these non-conforming or different organizations? What drives you?
Thanks very much for having me, and thank you for the question. So for me, yes, I'm enthusiastic and optimistic by disposition, but very concerned, particularly about the climate crisis. And I'm particularly concerned about how we seem to be struggling to correct course, to get back on a rational track. It seems like a big problem here is a lack of democracy, or a very surface, superficial type of democracy that doesn't really help us change course, stop over-consuming. And so I find alternative organizations really interesting and hopeful because they highlight different ways of organizing and organizing in more deeply democratic ways. And particularly, I've been thinking recently about how in kind of mass politics, when we go to the ballot box and when policymakers are designing policies, they're trying to appeal to us in our individualistic interests, the interests given the existing context, based on our insular lifestyles. And I think what we might need to address big problems, big crises like the climate crisis, is being able to develop kind of common interest. And alternative organizations, particularly ones that are interested in democracy, they're showing ways of doing that sort of developing common interest together.
Yeah, well, that's a big motivation and a big task. And of course, it's a crucial problem for all societies today. Mm-hmm. But then many of these alternative entities are quite small. They're quite insular, fragmented. How can that be translated into a larger impact?
Absolutely. So that's a crucial question. We can think about it as two broad strategies, ways of approaching trying to change bigger systems through the actions of an organization. So some alternative organizations that I'll work with will be thinking very strategically about what sorts of efforts can we make at the level of the organization to influence policy, to influence the market, for instance, to offer new products, for instance, lightweight electric vehicles, sharing, mobility, things like this that you've looked at with, what's the name of the organisation again? River Simple?
River Simple, indeed, a company here in Wales.
There we are. So this sort of an alternative organisation, it's small, but it's thinking very strategically about what sorts of changes can be made in the context of being a for-profit business that can have really significant effects at scale. Similar organisation that I'm looking at the moment is Big Solar Co-op. So they very intentionally are moving away from the idea of community energy, solar panels on roofs being necessarily a local initiative that I would invest, for instance, in the solar panel on my local primary school, on my church or whatever, and rather thinking what we need is community investment in solar energy that is distributed across the country, that's kind of diversified in terms of risk and things like this. So that's one approach where you're really looking at what's achievable right now from the organization level to make alternative futures, sustainable futures more possible.
So I think there's a learning process there, essentially.
There's a learning process, absolutely. Yeah, maybe you're expecting that once the alternative organization demonstrates that this is a viable way of doing things, it'll spread. The other end of the spectrum, alternative organizations that are maybe focused a little bit more on their internal process of co-constructing ideas of the common good, of experimenting with alternative lifestyles, low waste ways of living, low consumption, more kind of what George Monbiot calls public luxury. So rather than having your own private luxury within your household, that you could have private sufficiency and the luxury of a community garden, things like this. For me, I think these sorts of alternative organizations are very exciting and interesting for kind of a different reason, in that it's changing us as individuals.
Right.
So where public policy, for instance, needs to appeal to us based on our individualized interests, based on the idea that we want to continue with insular private luxury lifestyles, these alternative organizations that are maybe very small in scale are helping us become the sorts of citizens who can think of alternative ways of living, alternative ways of being, different sorts of interests. So rather than, it doesn't really matter who I vote for because all I care about is having more money in my pocket at the end of the day, if I am involved in, for instance, local food cooperative, if I'm involved in worker cooperatives, common-based peer production, where there's not so much of an idea about individual gain, then maybe it helps me think about other ways that we could configure society that wouldn't require so much extraction, so much consumption. I think that's really interesting.
What impresses me about this partly is you managed to retain that energy and that optimism, as you've described it, when we see that on the other side of this story, capitalism as a process, the companies that kind of form within it, they're getting bigger, the reach is getting wider, the penetration in society is getting deeper in many respects through things like privatization and deregulation and so on. And here you are, holding up this possibility of an alternative. And it seems to me that one of the issues here is that the alternatives are sometimes quite ephemeral. So how do you cope with that slightly transient nature sometimes of these entities?
Right, absolutely. I think it's an important question. Maybe the transient nature of organizations like these can be problematic, maybe for the strategy of trying to change society immediately in terms of what's achievable right now. Although, if you are demonstrating, for instance, that this new sustainable service can work, these disruptive business models, maybe you don't want to necessarily be the new monopoly of sustainable mobility. Maybe it's fine that the organization dissolves if...
Well, we actually had this in the academic sphere. I was part of the Greening of Industry Network, which when it was set up, it was a while back now, it was set up with a 10-year life so that it wouldn't become kind of institutionalized in its own right. And I thought that was a very interesting approach because it sort of, it recognizes then that you can ossify
Right,
under those
absolutely.
circumstances. So in terms of your work then, you spend your time kind of looking for these examples, but you're not passive. You're not passive by nature, I know, but you're not passive in terms of your research either. You seem to be working with rather than kind of working on.
Yes, and I think as much as anything, that's a feature of the organizations that I'm looking at.
Okay.
With a lot of these organizations, especially the ones that are influenced, shaped by the open source community, these online peer production, commons-based organizations, they're super porous. When I'm writing papers and they ask for a data table of like, how many members are there? You're like, well, how many members of Wikipedia are there? It's not really a relevant question for this sort of an organization, or it's at least very difficult to answer. And so in a way, engaging with an organization like the Open Food Network, for instance, very, very quickly, you're asked to participate.
Yes.
It's presumed that everybody contributes to the kind of work of maintaining the commons, which includes the knowledge commons of the processes? How do we make decisions more democratic, more inclusive? What sorts of strategic challenges are we facing? Things like this.
So this is interesting because a core part of public value is indeed taking your skills and capabilities into the world and contributing to change in a positive way. So what you've done there, you've combined both the alternative organisation, but also that public value mission to deploy those skills in a way that's really kind of beneficial, we hope, to those organisations. We live in hope.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I can see that's incredibly rewarding. And of course, you've been really successful in publishing on this. You know, you've got some fantastic academic articles. You've also written in The Conversation, which are in English and in French.
Translated by somebody else, thankfully.
Well, I assumed it was you, to be honest, because your PhD was in France, was it not?
Yes. So I was really lucky. By happenstance, I ended up in Grenoble in France, the southeast, and I didn't know when I was moving there for family reasons that this is a really, really interesting city. Very left, very green, very DIY. And so I feel like maybe a lot of what's influenced the hopeful aspects of my outlook is seeing, well, there are alternative ways of living. I don't need to own my own bicycle because we've got Metro Velo system where, well, of course, why wouldn't I use one of these shared bicycles that's taken care of, that is accessibly priced, when I've got a city that has such wonderful cycling infrastructure, things like this.
Yeah, this is interesting because real life grounds you in that way, you know, and it's important. Which kind of brings me to another set of issues, really. I think one of the struggles for someone like you is reconciling day-to-day life against the values and attitudes to which you aspire. And for example, would you consider a university to be an alternative organisation?
Oh, very interesting question. Yes, good question. Maybe a question that will be answered by the special issue of Organisation on what is alternative organisation, because it's not really clear right now what is a useful way of thinking of what alternative organising means. Is it specifically anti-capitalist? Is it aligned with values like autonomy and solidarity? Is it just different to what came before, in which case you would say Uber was an alternative organisation?
Okay, good point, yes.
I think I've been influenced by co-authors like Simone Schiller-Merkens recently, who's been talking about defining alternative organizations, that it would be useful to define it in terms of civic values, in which case I would say a public university is very much would be an alternative organization from that perspective, to the extent that the university is organised around serving the development of civic values amongst its students, amongst its staff. Maybe this would be a reason to resist financialization and privatization. That could be a useful use of the concept. So in that case, would be an explanation for why I'm particularly happy to work at a place like Cardiff Business School, where we do have this public value written into the identity of the organisation, and that every kind of decision that we make is always made in the context of, is this serving public value or not?
Yes, exactly. You brought in something to show us.
Okay.
It's actually a piece of paper.
It's actually a piece of paper.
Unbelievable.
So, because maybe the most recent research project that I've been working on with the help of the Public Value Engagement Fellowship, thank you very much,
Pleasure,
has been on democratic technology for cooperatives.
Oh, okay.
And so technology often means computers and other machinery. Often, in my case, it means digital tools like platforms like Lumio, developed by people who learned alternative ways of doing democratic decision making in the Occupy movement and tried to develop a platform that would support people to make decisions like this. Super, super interesting. I think they're really useful and really open up new possibilities for democratic organising. But it doesn't, like, technology doesn't have to be on a computer. Technology can be a set of guidelines, a procedure that we implement in an in-person meeting. And so here I've got from the Sustainability Law Centre, Creative Commons set of procedures for implementing consent-based decision-making.
Oh, okay.
And so this is something that you can do online, you can do in a Zoom meeting, but we can do in an in-person meeting, and maybe it's
You should have shown me this before we started.
We could have.
I might have got this all wrong.
We'd have to make a decision together.
Okay.
But I think it's a really, really powerful tool for doing this thing of finding a common interest. So rather than a vote where 51% of people get what they wanted coming into the room and 49% go away dejected and fomenting resistance, we come into the room curious about what the community wants, what's going to serve everybody. Maybe we come in with particular proposals, particular ideas and interests, but through a procedure of explaining why I want our organisation to take on a particular contract or engage in a particular
activity, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Absolutely. We then systematically go around the room asking for clarification, proposing amendments, and trying to get to a point where the proposal is safe enough for the organisation to try it. So it's not looking for consensus. If we're looking for consensus, we're not going to experiment very much.
But it's looking for understanding, I guess.
Yeah, right, absolutely. It's very much lined with like deliberative democracy and then seeing what works, and we can always revert
But
later.
one thing that's, and we're nearly out of time. I know. But one thing that is somewhat different to that is Just Stop Oil. And I feel I must ask you about that. You're very much committed to active participation in politics and particularly around climate change. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to work with, is that the phrase I'm looking for, to participate with Just Stop Oil, and what do you think you gained or the entity gained from this activity?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It's a question of public value. So I feel like as somebody who lives in the UK, who has a lot of autonomy over my time, who doesn't have caring responsibilities, I am in a position where I can do things like intentionally get arrested to put pressure on government for key decisions around the trajectory of the climate crisis. And so I chose to get involved with the actions of Just Stop Oil because it seemed so clear that missing the opportunity to influence government and influence Labour before they were in power, to commit to not issuing further fossil fuel licences, that missed opportunity, there'd be no going back. Once there's the investment permitted, as you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, it's very hard to turn that back.
Absolutely. And so most of my research is focused on alternative organizations, is focused on the local scale, but that's not enough by itself. We need also the collective action ultimately affected through public policy. And in a situation like this, that public policy really shapes what's possible going forward. I found working with Just Stop Oil fascinating. They've got really interesting ways of organising, really interesting, maybe non-conventional ways of thinking about what is democratic decision making, how much participation is there, how do we manage information security while also being transparent and open. So it was really, really valuable experience and also I think important from the perspective of shaping those future constraints.
Sure. Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot in a very short amount of time. We'll take up some of the discussion later, offline.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been the Cardiff Business School podcast on the power of public value. I've been discussing today with Dr. Genevieve Shanahan. It's been a fascinating journey through the meaning and content of alternative organisations and how even the smallest and apparently relatively ephemeral of those alternative organisations can offer us key pointers to a safer, cleaner, better world. Thank you very much.